It's 39 degrees, and we have a winter storm warning for the next couple of days.
And I'm going to play an intro real quick.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we are live. Hello, Orville Nation. So I've had some technical issues because I broke the screen on my Mac, and that combined with a few other things has made this a little crazy. But I am going to post this new YouTube link on Twitter, and we are up and running. I want to welcome, of course, Gil and Adega, and a nice, big, warm welcome to our friend Alan Dean Foster. Welcome, Alan.
Nice to be here.
There we go. Okay. How is and you were saying, Alan, that you already have nice weather out in the Southwest?
Yeah, we also have drought, which is not so nice, but the Anasazi were here and moved on, so I'm sure one of these days we'll probably move on too. But right now, everything is still okay, and we have our own well, which is nice. And, we're up in the mountains, so it's not like we're down in the desert with Phoenix and Tucson, where most of the people in Arizona live. A lot of people don't realize that a great deal of Arizona is quite mountainous, and if not for the fact that very few people comparatively live there, people would assume that it's like the Sahara, and it's very much not. Again, I would show people out the window, but all they would see is glare, although based on what you told me about the weather in Lawrence, Kansas, maybe some sun glare would probably be nice for a lot of people.
Oh, we have plenty of sun glare. It's just a winter storm warning in April 20th. I think the climate change data is in.
There are plenty of people who would certainly agree with you, Gil. I have friends in Australia, and outside of the zoological population there, which tries to kill everybody when it gets the chance, the weather's been trying to do so lately, and it's not a good situation down under.
Yeah.
Alan, before we get into how about just for an icebreaker, would you like to share what you shared with me not too long ago about your new symphony? You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, okay. I've always wanted to write orchestral music. I've listened to orchestral music all my life. My two favorite kinds of music are classical orchestral and heavy metal, which is one reason why I'm so interested now, having discovered them a few years ago, in bands like Nightwish and Amon Amarth and Evanescence and so many others. I could go on because they're kind of a synthesis of the two kinds. But I had a little more time starting last April, because everybody had a little more time at home because of the pandemic. And I thought, well, how am I going to fill this time? I can't go to gym because the gym's closed, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought I would try writing some orchestral music. And since then, I've done some short pieces and a symphonic poem to accompany one of my novels and 4 symphonies. And I'm currently writing the score for a ballet. So
wow,
it's been a lot of fun, and I can't play it back on my computer because it would sound awful coming over the pickup. But maybe one of these days, there'll be an orchestral performance, a real live performance somewhere. I know that Wildside Press, John Betancourt, has spoken about putting together a couple of CDs, which would include everything pretty much I've written so far, although they'd just be MP3s. They wouldn't be recordings of a live orchestra, but at least people would get to hear them. Synthetic instrumentation's come a long way, so it wouldn't sound like the Vienna Philharmonic, but at least people would get the idea. So that's another project that's in the works.
That's a good point. What is now that software that you use? I've used it. I think it's amazing, Alan. And I thank you so much for sharing that. What is the how big a difference is it from the synthetic to the once it's played in a real live orchestra?
It's funny. It depends on the instrument. Certain instruments, we're talking about a free software called MuseScore, by the way. There are more advanced music composition software that professionals use, like Sibelius, for example. But MuseScore is free, and for free software, it's more than competent. It depends on the instruments. The strings sound very much like they would sound naturally if played live, but the brass, for example, just doesn't have the resonance and the fullness that real trumpets or real horns would have. The woodwinds are kind of in between, depends on the woodwind, and so on down the line. What really does sound really good if you use it, which I've only used in the symphonic poem, the Drenga, is wordless choirs, men's and women's choirs. Those actually sound quite natural.
Really?
So you throw those in there, and
Haven't tried it.
if I had hundreds of thousands of dollars, I'd go hire an orchestra and have them play it, because you can print out individual parts for the individual instruments with the software. But I don't. And as I said, maybe one day there'll be a live performance of this piece or that piece. We'll see. Probably after I'm dead. Lots of these interesting things happen after the creative personality involved dies, like poor Philip K. Dick, who should be one of the wealthiest writers in the world based on adaptations of his short stories and books, but who died getting paid 10 cents a word before everything he did seemingly got made into a major motion picture.
My dad is an internationally renowned composer and violinist, and I know that
Really?
he used Finale at one point.
Yes.
I think that's passe by now, but I've seen several symphonic and orchestral plays of his work, and it's a big difference.
Yeah. Finale is much more impressive than free software, as it should be. It's right up there with Sibelius. That's actually the other one I was trying to think of besides Sibelius. But if you like, Gil, I'll send you a piece if you'll send me an email. You can
Sure.
pass it to him. And, he can go outside and throw up his lunch, or maybe have a kind word to say.
I think he'd like that.
I'm open to criticism either way. I have a friend, Brooke McEldowney, who was a professional music critic and concert violist, who does a strip called Nine Chickweed Lane and a fantasy strip called Pibgorn. Some wonderful stuff. And I've sent him some stuff, and I kind of get silence in regards to the music at the end, which may be a polite way of saying it's not my thing, but maybe it's because I never use violas. I think we're really getting off the subject matter here, but since y'all I'm real happy with violins, cellos, and contrabass. Too many strings, I don't. Well, matter of personal taste as a composer.
Alan, how did we've talked before, but there's certain things I haven't asked you. How, like, for example, you're obviously what from a I'm a psychologist, so from a psychobiographical point of view, what was your childhood like? What was your schooling like? Your friends, what was your childhood like? I know you're laughing at me, but
No, not at all. It's a common question.
yeah.
And my responses are, pretty straightforward. Sorry, I have these moments. I'll just give you something to work with later. I had a depressingly, well, that's the wrong word. I had a perfectly normal middle class childhood. My father was in the dress business. His grandfather was in the dress business. I grew up, we moved from New York when I was 5 to Los Angeles, to the San Fernando Valley, which was still half orange groves and almond groves at the time. Lovely place really to grow up. I mean, there was a sheep and chicken farm across the street from where we grew up, and that was in Sherman Oaks, which, for people who know what Sherman Oaks is like now, is almost unfathomable. And I
Like
had
it is in Chinatown.
no, but it was a very normal childhood. As far as since people would probably be more curious about specific influences on what I ended up doing, my father read a little science fiction, although he had very little time to read, because after a while he had to go to work for Sears and then Montgomery Ward, and died in his early 60s from Alzheimer's, unfortunately. But he loved science fiction, and when he could convey it to me. My uncle Howie Horowitz, loved science fiction and never really got a chance to do much of it. Became a very well-known television producer, produced 77 Sunset Strip. For those of you who remember that show, Batman. He did TV Batman.
That was my first word.
Wow.
Batman. Your dad must have been really confused.
Well, I'm probably unhappy, but I heard from my sister and my brother that my crib was pretty close to the TV, and they would come home from school and go na 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 na, and I'd go Batman. So
I can see that. There are worse first words.
yeah,
So anyway, there was science fiction around the house, and science fiction was discussed, and it was the first thing I started reading for pleasure, and then got into the classics when I was in junior high and high school, and then moved on my last year in high school, rediscovered as it was science fiction. My mother uh, played piano by ear, did a mean version of the solo version of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, which I absolutely adored as a little child. I didn't understand what was going on, just that the sounds were great. I was taken to see Fantasia as a very young child. I'm sure that's what got me started on classical music, because there wasn't much in the way of recordings around the house. We had 78s, speaking from a historical viewpoint now, and there was Beethoven's Fifth and a few other things that I don't even remember. But I do remember as a child trying to conduct Beethoven's Fifth in my bedroom, and which I'm sure worried my parents no end. And but I loved when she would play the piano, and she tried to get a teacher to give me piano lessons, and I wanted a drum set, which would not fly in our household. It wasn't a big house, and so that didn't happen. And so I just spent the next 50 years listening to music without trying to play an instrument or learning anything about music from a technical standpoint. I started writing science fiction as a senior at UCLA. I was taking a lot of film writing courses, film history courses, and I started playing around with prose. Oddly enough, none of the teleplays or screenplays that I wrote for my writing classes were science fiction. It was historical fiction and a love story set in Japan called Shoji's, and anything but science fiction or fantasy. But when I started writing prose, I did start with science fiction. I wrote 12 stories, none of which sold, and the 13th story sold. So there's a lesson there for people who are worried about the number 13. And that's how it all got started. But my childhood was very, very normal. My parents were quiet, in love, but quiet, very undemonstrative. Didn't show emotion around the house, not around the children anyway. And as my Aunt Harriet, who was married to my Uncle Howie, the producer, said, that's a good in-joke, by the way, for people who are fans of that show. Bruce Wayne's always talking about his Aunt Harriet. Well, that's where the name came from. My uncle's wife. And so that's how it all got started.
Can I ask, Alan, were your parents affectionate with you?
They weren't,
or in their own way, I guess.
I guess in there. My father thought I came from Mars. I mean, we literally had no connection. This was the guy who got up. I didn't understand what his life had been like until much later after he was gone, as is often the case with many families. He'd been in the army. He was, I think, the 134th guy drafted in World War II. Went in as an enlistee, came out a captain, wanted to make a career out of the army. My mother did not want to raise a couple of army brats. Me and my sister insisted he get a permanent job. His father, who was hard as nails, had come over as an immigrant and made a lot of money in the dress business. And my father just kind of went that way. He wanted to stay in the army. That didn't work. He wanted to become an engineer. That didn't work out. He thought of going pro as a golfer. He was a scratch golfer, but there was no money in it back then because there was no TV money. He just ended up staying in the business that his father had started. My mother was affectionate toward me, but there wasn't a lot of hugging and kissing. There was a great deal of encouragement from my mother. Again, my father was the guy who got up, disappeared in the morning, came home at night, and immediately retired to the TV. That was
like so many dads. Yeah.
Like so many dads. That was one middle-class dads, particularly. That was just who he was. And he did not understand me at all. I mean, I grew up questioning things. Well, why is that? What's the meaning behind that? I didn't care if they were stupid answers. Why is the sky blue? Well, it just is. That was never good enough for me, those kinds of answers. He could have said because, there was an invisible prince in the sky who had control of the colors of the atmosphere, and blue is his favorite color. And I would have bought that for a while as a kid. But my father was just, because it is. I would say, well, why should I have to do this? Because I said so. Because that's the way he was raised. It wasn't his fault. And I didn't care. I needed it. He would say, does there have to be an answer for everything? And I would say yes, innocently, because that's who I was. But for him, it was rebellion. It was resistance. We never connected. My mother, I guess, saw some kind of potential and something, encouraged me in whatever I wanted to do. Even when I got into USC Law School and said, no, I'm not going to law school. I just got into the UCLA Graduate Film School. I'm going to go there for a couple of years. And there was shock at that announcement, but she was supportive. I think my father was too stunned to say anything. But he had a tough life. He never got to do any of the things he really wanted to do for his entire life. And I started to see that when I got into college, when I got into UCLA. And I vowed at that point two things, because he'd been fired by Sears after 10 years flawless work for them. I'm going to work for myself, whatever I do. I'm not going to work for somebody else. And I'm going to try and do something creative, even if it's within the legal profession. Then I got into the UCLA Graduate Film School, and I sold a couple of short stories, and I got a part-time teaching job at Los Angeles City College, teaching screenwriting and film history. And lo and behold, after I was giving myself a year. I had a year's rent saved on my cheap little apartment. I owned my car, a single guy. Figured I can spend a year and get enough money to pay for food and gas, these two part-time teaching gigs, and they were nighttime teaching gigs. I'll have the daytime to go body surfing and write. And it worked out. And sometimes your life hinges on very small decisions.
I'm a big fan of body surfing.
It was wonderful. I was living right at the beach in Santa Monica, right by the famous pier. It was literally 2 blocks from the pier. And I would go out, I would ride in the mornings. In the afternoons, when it warmed up a little bit, I'd go out and get bashed by the waves and the kelp and the sandals and the used medical equipment. Bora Bora, it's not, but I didn't know any different at the time. It was great. It was just great. It was a great time. Great time to be there at the beach and do single. And then I started selling books and, met this wonderful gal who was completely different from me and had no interest in me whatsoever. And that was 46 years ago. As I said, small things.
And she's with you now, right?
That's right. Been married 46 years.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. And you just don't know. We're complete opposites. We have absolutely nothing in common. Well, not absolutely nothing in common, but
You're married. You have that in common.
yeah.
Which means you
opposites sometimes
complement
work
each
really
other.
well. My wife and I, we've been married 31 years, and a lot of people look at us and say, "How do you guys do it?" And it's easy, But it's because we come at things different. We want to cooperate. Works well. So, congrats on 46.
It's work. It's work. But the end result is always worthwhile.
Alan, any regrets from other, from parts of your life with anything professionally or most notably?
Professionally, it's a kind of a mixed bag. I do have people say, well, after Star Trek, after you wrote the story for the first Star Trek movie, why didn't you write more movies? And it was not a good experience. People can read about it. It's been well documented. All the documentation is available online, both in actual books and just people talking. And so people know it was not a happy experience for me. And that's what I thought I was going to do. I had a Master in Fine Arts in Film from UCLA, from the screenwriting department. My Uncle Howie had died tragically in a hiking accident in the Sierras, but I still had distant contacts from that. And I could have stayed in Los Angeles and pushed. But a number of things intervened. My wife, Joanne, hated Los Angeles. She hated the film business. She could spot a phony a mile away. You know how some people have a sixth sense for certain things. She has a sixth sense for phonies. So she's from a town of 300 people in West Texas, central West Texas. So she didn't like LA. She certainly didn't like the film business. And I thought that's what I was going to do, was write movies and maybe become the first science fiction writer to actually direct a science fiction film. But what I discovered while working on Star Trek was, while I love movies, and I'd come close several times before Star Trek, one time with a young would-be producer who obviously had no prospects, named Ronnie Shusett, who later went on to do Alien and Total Recall. That's a whole story in itself, how Ronnie and I got together, and almost sold a couple of projects to ABC Films back when the networks were doing more movies for TV.
How did you get together?
Yeah, I'll tell you in a second.
Okay.
Finish one first. What I found out was I love movies, but I don't love the movie business. And there are people, some of them long-term friends of mine, who love everything about it. They love the parties, they love the schmoozing, they love discussing projects that they've had in the works for 10, 20 years. They love every bit of it, and I don't. I'm very straightforward, as PJ knows. I speak my mind. I don't like parties. I don't like having to be nice to people that I don't want to have to be nice to. None of this is a good mix for success in the film business. Do you know the Australian comic Jim Jeffries? You all should. Does a classic routine on gun control, which is as timely now as when he first did it. Did one on being invited to be the entertainment at a Hollywood party. And I couldn't have said it better myself, except that Jim uses more four-letter words than I do. But it's a great routine if you look it up it's on YouTube. So we decided to pick up and move to Central Arizona. Figured if anything happens with film, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I'll sit there and write my books and nobody will bother me. And if I'd stayed in Los Angeles, I would probably be in motion pictures or television, and I'd get a 1/16 size shot of myself in the back of People magazine once a year, maybe. But this was better. This gave me time to travel. My mental state was certainly better. I wouldn't be married to my wife for 46 years or even 4 months if we'd stayed in Los Angeles, probably. So sometimes things work out for the best, even if it doesn't seem that way to other people. What was your question, PJ? Sorry.
How did you guys get together?
I was living at the beach in Santa Monica, directly across from the main beach, right down from the pier, as I said. And I was very shy around members of the opposite sex my whole life until two things happened. I moved to the beach and got an apartment there, and I bought a 1-year-old Corvette. And also three things, I started selling. So I went from being I don't want to say repressed, from being a very shy, bookish nerd to a young writer living at the beach driving a Corvette. And lo and behold, my social life suddenly changed radically, all for the better. But I was still kind of shy. So I was walking home. I'd been at the beach for 3.5 years. I was walking home one day. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that layout of that part of Los Angeles, but you have the Long Beach. Then you have a slight rise with steps going up to the first real street. And then there are apartment buildings. So I was heading for my building and I saw this really beautiful girl sitting on the steps with her chin resting on her fist, looking very down. And I went right past her. Remember what I said earlier about your life hinging on small things? I got halfway across the street and I'm thinking to myself, really pretty girl, why don't you go back and say something to her? So I went back to her and said, you look really down. And she proceeded to give me 10 minutes on how she had just broken up with her latest boyfriend. She wasn't interested in talking to anybody. She wasn't interested in getting involved with anybody. And when she finished, I said, well, I live right across the street. Why don't you come up to my place for a glass of iced tea? And she said, yeah, sure, why not? And that was how we got together. She was living a block and a half away from where I was living in her own apartment at that time. Many years later, she told me, she said, the only reason I agreed to go with you was because nobody had ever invited me for a glass of iced tea. I didn't drink, still don't. And that was, that piqued her curiosity, I guess, or shocked her, or both. That's how we got together.
Great story.
She also introduced me to rock music. I had listened to nothing but classical music my whole life. I grew up as a kid in the 50s. I didn't like the music from the 50s. Music from the 60s, yeah, that was better, but I was still filling out my knowledge of classical music. And Joanne wasn't into classical music. She was into rock and blues. I thought all I knew about blue was it was a color at that point. And we had been together for a while, and there's a really good venue not far from where both of our places were, called the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium. And she came in one day and she said, Patti LaBelle and the LaBelles are playing here. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? She said, we've got to go. We can walk to the auditorium. So we went and saw Patti LaBelle and the LaBelles, which is what it was called at that time. Wear Something Silver. That was Patti LaBelle's big thing at the time. And I enjoyed it. I didn't go berserk, but I enjoyed it. And on that basis, she had to constantly prod me. Well, we're going to go see this three-piece band from Texas called ZZ Top. And I'm like, I never heard of them. Who's ZZ Top? And she said, they're playing with Roy Orbison. I'm like, who's Roy Orbison? And so she really introduced me to a lot of rock. I kind of discovered metal on my own. And as we were married, we went to a lot of live shows that kind of read like a history of rock. Now we saw Queen with Freddie Mercury.
Oh,
Billy
wow.
Squier was the opening act. We saw Pink Floyd. We saw John Mellencamp. We saw, Led Zeppelin at the LA Forum with the USC Marching Band, who are the recorded band on the track Tusk from that album. We actually saw them. They had the band there. Great stuff. Great stuff.
Alan,
Metal came later.
I think this merits the question, how has Mrs. Foster influenced your work?
That's a very good question that I don't think anybody's ever asked me before, PJ, believe it or not. Not consciously. She likes science fiction and fantasy, but she doesn't read it. She prefers film and TV, which is fine. You know, Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, his wife never read anything Bob ever wrote. Frank Herbert's first wife never read anything Frank ever wrote, never read Dune or anything. So it's not one of those relationships where the partner reads and then offers criticism and stuff. Occasionally I would come in and be excited because I'd tell somebody, say, wrote this really, really great chapter today, or half a chapter or a page or whatever. And years later I would do that, and she said, I would say, don't you want to read something that I've written? She said, why? You always tell me about it. I've already heard it. Don't have to read it. But she has influenced me in non-conscious ways.
Exactly.
She's a very sensitive, very straightforward woman. And it certainly has influenced the way I have portrayed, since I've been married to her, the way I portrayed female characters. Not that I'm sitting there thinking, well, I'm going to have this character and I'm going to think back to what Joanne said about women, but it's always there in the back of my mind. More specifically, not so much I'm going to do this with this female character, but I'm not going to do this with this female character. When you're married to a strong woman, it really does influence or vice versa, really does influence the way you think about that other character. Many times I'll base characters on people I've met. And you can find that throughout all my work. I think every writer does that, every writer of fiction. And it won't be necessarily a literal portrayal of that person, with the name change, but sometimes it'll be very close. As an example, I did a book called Catch-a-Lot many years ago, Commonwealth book. And just for fun, I thought before I started, I said, there aren't going to be any white people in this book. I'm not going to say that anywhere in the book, but there will be no obviously Anglo-Saxon people in this book. And also, everybody in that book is based on somebody I met, somebody I still know, or somebody I met. Just to give you an example, will lead to another story. I needed a distinguished Asian entrepreneur, industrialist. When Joanne and I were on our honeymoon, we made a trip all around Asia and the South Pacific. We found ourselves in Kuala Lumpur. We needed a room for a few nights. We ended up at the oldest hotel in Kuala Lumpur, which is a very different city, in 1975, called the Majestic Hotel, which had been built by the Japanese in 1936. And it was like something out of a Somerset Maugham story. It was old, it was fading, but the major domo there was this 6-foot-tall Chinese guy, one of the most distinguished looking gentlemen I've ever seen. And he became the basis for the industrialist in Catch-a-Lot. Now, as a corollary to that story, that hotel has since been renovated and expanded by a very high-class hotel group. The original building is preserved, but they put 2 towers up behind it. And I had written about this incident in the course of many writings. The hotel group, the publicity and advertising group representing the hotel group was getting ready to prepare their grand reopening of the hotel, got in contact with me, said, is there anything you remember about it? They're trying to reconstruct the interior of the original building as close to the original appearance as possible. Anything you remember about the bed sheets? Anything you remember about the curtains? So I sent them what I remembered, and my wife had a coffee cup from the hotel, sent him a picture of that. And I also sent him a picture, which I had taken for reference purposes, of the Chinese gentleman who served as the major domo at the hotel. And that picture appeared with the ad in kind of a slick magazine as part of advertising the reopening, along with my story. And I did a conference call, Skype call with video with the advertising people, very energetic group of young Malaysians. We had a great time. Weeks went by and I get an email from this gal in Malaysia saying, how do you know my grandfather? And the picture, that was her grandfather. She was thrilled to see another picture of her grandfather, who was obviously long since deceased. And so you have all these odd connections. It's the Kevin Bacon syndrome, degrees of separation. And if I ever get back to Kuala Lumpur, I have a free room at a hotel. So. So that's
Alan,
one way I use people that I've met in stories.
Diego, you were going to say something?
No, I just that was actually very. I have ties in Asia, and it makes me think of different cultural things. Just bringing up the major domo aspect and how much respect they give for some of their jobs and things reminds me of a friend who taught me some martial arts. So.
No, when I started going to science fiction conventions, the first one was in Berkeley in 1968, which was an interesting time to be in Berkeley anyway. But I went to the World Science Fiction Convention that year, which was in Berkeley, first science fiction convention I'd ever gone to. And I was thrilled at the thought of meeting some of my idols who I had read growing up. And I thought that these guys and gals spent their time researching their stories by hacking their way through impenetrable jungles and climbing unscalable mountains, doing all of these exotic things. And I was shocked to discover that none of them did anything like that. They did all of their research from back issues of Scientific American and Nature magazine. And I couldn't understand how they could create and describe alien cultures without experiencing what different cultures were on offer here on Earth. And I had resolved at that point that I was going to see as much of the planet as I possibly could, because it was unlikely I was going to ever get to see another one. And that's what I've been doing most of my life, not most of my life, a lot of my life. When I wasn't writing, I was traveling. And I didn't take a notebook. I didn't take a laptop when those became available, although I knew writers who did. But I took a camera and then later a video camera so I could get sound as well as pictures. And that also provides background and research for a lot of my books. Sometimes I'd get a whole book out of a trip. Sometimes I would just get characters or environments. But I certainly got different cultural aspects. There's a small island that's part of the country, the nation of Vanuatu. The island is called Tanna, and they have a really interesting specific culture that's specific to the island. Basically, they've rejected modern society.
What's the island called?
Tanna, Tanna. And it's a volcanic island, has a very famous, constantly active volcano, which is quite accessible to visitors. It's the main reason people go to Tanna, those who do. And you can stand on the edge of the volcano and lava goes shooting up above you. And the local people are very familiar with this volcano, obviously. They know if there's trouble. They have different levels of activity and when it's safe to visit, when it's not safe to visit. But it's quite an experience to stand on the lip of an active volcano and see lava shooting up on a regular basis. It's almost like a clock. It's the old faithful of volcanoes. I just can't remember the volcano of him, but it's apparently been doing this for hundreds of years. Captain Cook recorded it when he sailed by the island in the 18th century. But there's an excellent book about Tanna called the something in the canoe. I can't remember all of it, by a European ethnologist. And I was fascinated by the idea that you would have this group of people in a modern society who basically reject everything about a modern society. This is the same group of people who were in the news recently who kind of worship Prince Philip as a god because he came there one time. So that Tanna got mentioned recently. I thought that's an excellent basis for a whole novel. And that became the basis of a book called The Howling Stones. So that's how travel can really directly influence what I do. Really good coffee grown there, by the way. If you ever get a chance to find any coffee from Tanna, it's good stuff.
Gil, go ahead. You have a question? Couple questions?
Yeah. I'm curious, were you friends with other science fiction writers of your generation? Larry Niven, Mike Resnick, Robert Sheckley, Harry Harrison, and so on. I imagine you must have signed novels next to them at myriad conventions.
Well, I made it a point when I started going to conventions because I really wanted to meet these people who I had read and enjoyed. That's why most people, I think, went to conventions. And I didn't know anybody, really. I knew David Gerald a little bit from the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society, which still holds regular meetings in Los Angeles. Ray Bradbury was a member of that club. Fritz Leiber was a member of that club. Many notables in the field, Forey Ackerman. So I knew David a little bit, but that was about it as far as, published successful writers. I knew Larry Niven a little bit, still know Larry a little bit. But when I started going to conventions, I said, I'm going to meet as many people, as many writers and artists and publishers as I possibly can. And I made it a special point to try and meet the older writers, people like Edmund Hamilton and Lee Brackett, or E. Hoffman Price, who I knew wouldn't be around all that long. When I traveled to other conventions, I did the same thing. Especially sought out writers who didn't go to conventions except local ones. Daniel Gaui in New Orleans, Clifford Simak, great writer in the upper Northwest, R.A. Lafferty, when I was in that part of the world. But when I started, I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anything about conventions. I ended up at a subsidiary hotel, and they had bus shuttle service to the main convention hotel. And one day I was riding next to this guy down on, he was dressed all in white and looked, now in retrospect, a lot like Doc from the Back to the Future films. Big shock of silver hair, and didn't say a word to him, of course, and get off the bus. And another guy my age at the time, another 20-year-old said, you know who you were riding all the way over to the hotel next to? I said, no. He said, Fritz Leiber Jr. I'm like, okay, should have said something. And I ended up spending one day, it was a wonderful convention, one day spent about 30 minutes discussing publishing science fiction and the Vietnam War with this very accommodating, much older gentleman who I was really intrigued with because he had a butch haircut. And remember, this is Berkeley, 1968. There weren't a lot of butch haircuts running around back then. More like what I look like now. And later, a friend I had made at the convention said, you know who you've been arguing with for the last 30 minutes? And I said, no, who? He said, John W. Campbell.
Were you arguing?
About the Vietnam War? Yes. About publishing, not so much. He ended up publishing my first story. But there was no connection at the time professionally. Just sent it in and never said, hey, you remember that kid you were talking to? Funny how that works sometimes. I found out at the convention that most writers, and there are SOBs in any business, and science fiction writing is no exception, but most of them were very accommodating if you were polite and respectful, and especially if you had read their work. Because writers are delighted to talk about their own work every opportunity they get. So I met a lot of people there. I had started buying science fiction in hardcover to read, not to collect, although I still have them all, turned out to become a collection. And I couldn't take a whole box of books. I didn't know people did this. So I took one book. I had one book that I thought I could get a lot of signatures in. It was called Dangerous Visions. And I ended up getting a lot of the writers, those who were there, who had stories in that collection to sign next to their stories. And Harlan Ellison signed Harry Harrison's name, and Harry signed Harlan's name. I didn't, I'm a 20-year-old kid here. I don't know what the hell's going on. Great collection, by the way, famous collection.
Yeah.
That was my first collection. And that was where I learned that nobody went anyplace. Nobody traveled. There were no world travelers at that time, at least none that I knew. The closest probably would have been Harry Harrison, who had moved to Ireland. And he and his wife, because at least at that time, I don't know if it's still the same, but if you could prove that you made your living as a creative person, writer, musician, sculptor, you didn't pay any taxes. You pay any local taxes. That's why Anne McCaffrey moved to Ireland, or at least a major reason why she did so. Well, Harry had moved to Ireland, and he and his wife spent some time driving around Europe. That was the closest to a world traveler I met who wrote science fiction. I didn't meet anybody who went to Africa or South America or the Pacific or any of those places. But I was determined to do that. It's changed somewhat since then.
I read a lot of novelizations when I was too young to see the movies, Alien being one, but not just yours, although I have read a lot of your books, but I've also read Jay Anson and David Seltzer. And I noticed not only that I was too young to be reading those books and others like Logan's Run, but I noticed that the novelizations grew the story and contained far more world building than the films. Can you speak to that?
I never planned to do novelizations. It was just something that was thrown at me early in my career. I was happy to do it. I loved film, as I said, and I thought, gee, I can make my own director's cut of all of these films if they'll let me. And I also thought, I was familiar with James Blish's novelizations of the original Star Trek episodes, and I didn't understand, as much as I enjoyed James Blish's original work, I didn't understand how he could get away with writing those books that way. I thought, this is nothing but a transcription of the screenplay. This isn't right. It isn't fair to the reader. Never mind talking about literary qualities or anything like that, because Blish was a fine writer. I thought you have to get at least 50% original material, or there's no point in even doing this. That was the way I felt about it. So I got to put in all of those things that I thought not only should be in the film or in the book version of the film, but that I wanted to see, in the hopes that the publisher / editor / film studio would leave them in. Sometimes they
So it's your fault that the book is better than the movie then.
I'll leave that to the readers. That's of course the most flattering thing that anyone can say about a novelization. And people have said it, and I'm happy to accept the compliment. What happened with the very first one was somebody at Ballantine Books had bought the rights. Stop me, PJ, if I've told this story already. Someone at Ballantine Books had bought the rights to a really awful Italian movie called Luana, but I didn't know it was an awful movie at the time. And Judy Lynn Del Rey had just come in and become the editor of the science fiction line at Ballantine, and her husband, Lester Del Rey, took care of the fantasy line. And Judy Lynn knew that I had this degree in film from UCLA, and on that basis assumed that I knew my way around the film script and asked me, she said, would you be interested in making a book out of this film? And being a young writer, I naturally said, sure, without having any idea of what it might entail. I said, send me the screenplay. I'll work from the screenplay. And she said, well, there is no screenplay. We don't have a copy of the screenplay. But we'll set up a showing of the film for you in Los Angeles. This was 1972, if I remember correctly, 3 years before I was married, before we moved to Big Bear Lake, where we lived for 3 years. So I was by myself. I'm living at the beach, got plenty of time to do this sort of thing. I said, well, okay, I'll take notes. I didn't think that was really the right way to do it. It was all I had. So I went to the office of the producer who had bought the rights to this film, walked upstairs. It was off Hollywood Boulevard. And it's a little room with a screen set up, guy with a projector, projection booth. Got my pad, my pen, ready to take notes. Film starts. It's all in Italian. No subtitles. I don't speak Italian. I spoke a little subsequently, but not at that time. I said, what the hell am I supposed to do with this? And as it turned out, it didn't really matter because the film was so bad that I was able to follow it anyway. So it's basically a female Tarzan story. Italian group gets, stuck in the jungle. Here comes the female Tarzan to rescue them. She's actually only on screen for about 5-10 minutes throughout the whole movie. A little Vietnamese gal. And film stops and it's like, what the hell am I going to do? I've agreed to do this. I've committed myself. Well, there was a young guy who had been hired by the producer to do advertising and PR for the film. And he was a fan. And he had hired Frank Frazetta to do 2 promotional paintings for the film, which would be used throughout the film's promotion. And I saw the 2 paintings and I thought, now that's my idea of a female Tarzan. I had grown up watching, among other things, a show called Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, which starred a 6-foot-tall blonde gal named Irish McCalla. Also my idea of a female Tarzan, of a female anything. It was so young, I didn't really know what was going on, but I thought there's something going on here beyond black and white, cheap television stories. It's called puberty. So I had Irish McCalla in mind, and then I had the 2 Frank Frazetta paintings. And I thought, okay, I'm going to novelize Frank Frazetta's paintings. And they used both of them on the book. One is the cover, one is shown partially on the back cover. That's why the book is dedicated to Frank Frazetta. And what I did essentially was write my own female Tarzan story. And that's became the book. The kicker to that is after the book came out, I get a call from Judy Lynn who says, you'll love this. I just got a call from somebody at Disney who saw the book, didn't realize it was a novelization of an existing film, wanted to know if the film rights to the book were available. So we had a good laugh and a good cry over that one. So I actually got started doing movie adaptations by writing something completely original. The second one, if I remember correctly, was on the basis of that, they had bought the rights to a student film called Dark Star by these two kids from USC, John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon, who had managed to wangle a commercial release of the film because it had been picked up by a famous, iconic schlock Hollywood producer named Jack Harris, whose big film was The Blob. And could I do a novelization of that? And I said, sure, you actually have a script this time. And turned out to be a 70-minute, very short film, just barely long enough to qualify as a feature film, about three guys floating around in space talking about how bored they are. That's probably to this day the hardest book I've ever had to write.
Really?
And then came the Star Trek logs, and in the middle of that came Star Wars.
Which kind of segues into my next question. After Disney's 2012 acquisition of Lucasfilm, as well as the rights to the Alien franchise via their 2019 purchase of 20th Century Fox, you accused the Walt Disney Company via the Science Fiction Writers of America of not paying you royalties for ebook sales of your books. Can you tell us if that has changed and how things are proceeding with that?
Yes, surprise. Not just ebooks, but print editions of the books as well. So it wasn't just ebooks. Basically, what happened was Disney got, or their accounting department got occupied with many things when they picked up 20th Century Fox and Lucasfilm. And there was a lot to process. And my agent, Vaughn Hansen at the Virginia Kid Agency, kept asking for royalty statements because we had received regular royalty statements twice a year from previous rights holders on both properties. And they just stopped. They just stopped coming. And she tried to get somebody to say what was going on. And make a long story short, and nothing happened. We basically got ignored. And that's why the Science Fiction Writers of America got involved. This is a writers organization that really sticks up for its writers. There's no fooling around here. If you've got a problem, you go to them. If you're a member of the organization, they'll respond and do something. And they got involved, and they sort of got ignored. And that's when the whole thing, it was decided the only way we were going to get any proper response here is to go public with it, which nobody wanted to do. Nobody, it doesn't benefit anybody. But there was no choice. We were left with no choice. And as soon as we went public, it went viral within 24 hours all over the planet. And subsequent to that, serious discussions commenced on how to resolve the situation. And I expect them to be resolved completely by the end of this month, possibly early next month. So progress, yes, real progress has been made. Other writers came out of the woodwork and said, well, you know what? We're in the same situation. And some of them have already been paid. And so the best thing to come out of this, because there's not a great deal of money involved for anybody, including me, but there is money involved, is that a principle has been established and a precedent has been established. Nobody had to go to court, thank goodness, because nobody benefits from that except the lawyers on both sides. And it was good. It was good that we did this. It's sad that we had to go public, but in the long run, it benefits writers all over the continuum.
Absolutely.
Thank you for the fight.
Alan,
Yes.
would you
I was in a
characterize? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was in a position to do this, whereas a lot of younger writers and other writers were not, for all sorts of reasons, not just financial, but all sorts of reasons. And there was an important principle involved. And I was asked, I said, do you want to go ahead with this? And I said, yeah, I'm going to go ahead with this. I've only been involved in something like this one time previously where I had to sue or threatened to sue because they settled a week before the film came out, a major Hollywood studio. And it's very much like it's a war. And you know, you're the sniper sitting in the forest, and here comes the 4th Panzer Division. But sometimes you just have to look through the scope. Boy, I'm really stretching this analogy.
I'm not so sure you are.
Sometimes you just have to take a stand. And I was lucky enough to find a really good law firm in Los Angeles. I'm lucky enough to know the right people in the right place sometimes, who looked at that particular case and said, you're right, and you're so right that we'll take this case on a contingency basis, which meant that I didn't have to put up 5 figures up front just to file anything. As it turns out, it never went to court or arbitration or anything else, because as I said, the studio settled the week the film was released. And I signed an NDA and I can't speak to it.
Right.
So
Alan,
I think
sorry.
a similar fight's going to be coming up for all these different authors and artists for Amazon. I'm sure you know how they're treating people.
We'll see. I'm not a party to that.
Mm.
The only thing I can say to that is I'm really curious to see what they do with Asimov's Foundation trilogy, because that's not a shoot 'em up. And so it's not typical Hollywood science fiction. Real science fiction can be made in Hollywood, and you get films like Arrival or Annihilation. It can be done, but they're much more comfortable with something where things get blown up real nice.
Right.
Alan, was the confusion, was the root of the confusion just that Disney is this big, huge company? Is that have something to do with it? But the fact that you were ignored?
I can't document it, but yeah, I think that's what it was. It's just this gargantuan organization. It's the Amazon of the entertainment business, if you want to make that analogy. And it just kind of got lost in the shuffle. I mean, somebody's looking at it and, these are back royalties owed on some books that were owned by a company that we just bought. And we're trying to sort out the accounting for, the Star Wars trilogy film results from China kind of thing. And it probably just got kicked down to the bottom of the trough in the accounting department. And it was easier for people just to ignore it. And if you let them ignore it, they'll continue to ignore it. So you have to make noise sometimes so that it moves up the level till it reaches the notice of somebody who says, wait a minute, this is not good. We just saw an article in The Guardian in Britain and an article in this paper in Singapore. And there's going to be an article in the Wall Street Journal next week. And pretty soon say, well, we probably ought to attend to this. The sad thing is there was no reason for it to happen. As I said, the amount of money involved for everybody in total, not just for me, but every writer who had an interest in this particular situation could probably have been paid by picking out the loose change from the cushions in the executives' lounge at Disney in Burbank. What it cost Disney in terms of bad publicity was far, far worse than what they actually had to pay out in actual cash. But this is what happens sometimes. Corporations get so big that the people who can make decisions, the things that they should make decisions on sometimes, it never comes to their notice. They don't know what's going on. I'm sure there were people who, when this started to become not just public knowledge, but wide public knowledge, started getting a response. We're looking around at each other saying, what the hell's going on? What's this? I never heard anything about this. Nobody brought this to my notice. If they brought it to my notice, this would have been settled months ago. But that's any big corporation is like that.
Was there any input from Lucasfilm or George Lucas on this matter?
No, nor should there have been. Lucasfilm had sold the rights to everything to Disney, and George is more properly paying attention to building his museum in Los Angeles, which Chicago will be sorry they lost. Which museum I'm very interested in seeing, because there's no museum quite like it in the United States. If I understand it correctly, it's to be a museum of illustrative arts. Need I say, the kind of art that people like to go see. There won't be any Picasso in it. There won't be, I'm just shooting the breeze here. I don't know what's going to be in it. There aren't going to be any Picasso or Braque or Kandinsky. There are going to be illustrators from turn of the century magazines, places, magazines like The Strand out of London, which had famous illustrators and illustrations. I would expect people like N.C. Wyeth to be in there, and J.D. Leyendecker and Frazetta, illustrative art. And there should be a museum like that. And people will love it because people love seeing art like that. There are plenty of other museums
Exciting.
where you can go see balloon animals and a giant boulder suspended over a ditch. Art is in the eye of the beholder. And it's not the kind of art I like. I like art that looks like art that provokes an emotional response in me or an intellectual response, one of the two.
As all art should do.
Thank you, Ann. I write a column called Perceivings for a monthly magazine newspaper magazine here in Central Arizona called Five Senses. And the column's called Perceivings. You can read it for free online.
Five
And it's
senses.
about art, science, and culture. And I've talked about my feelings about art, music, and writing, and cereal packaging, and lots of other things over the years. In fact, we just put together a book of the first 100 columns called If You Shoot the Breeze, Are You Murdering the Weather? And just finished putting that together and editing it, so it hasn't even been submitted to a publisher yet, but hopefully somebody will put that out. That's 8 years worth of columns.
How did this situation with Lucasfilm or Disney impact your novelization of The Force Awakens? Did the same thing happen there?
No, it still hasn't, because the contract for that is with Valentine Del Rey Books. And we never stopped getting royalties on that. And so that's a different situation entirely. The only books from Lucasfilm that were impacted by this situation were the novelization of the original film and the sequel novel I wrote called Splinter the Mind's Eye. Force Awakens, The Approaching Storm, as far as I know, we still get regular twice a year royalty reports from Valentine. And of course, I wrote both of those books way before this situation happened. So,
well, I'm glad to hear that that's a situation that's going to be resolved.
Alan, I don't mean to put you on the spot with this question, but there's a lot of people who wanted to ask you this in the chat, and
sure.
Feel free to answer or don't answer. Do you see any leadership change coming at Lucasfilm?
I live in Prescott, Arizona. That is a long way from this little planet that's bordered on 4 sides by Santa Monica Boulevard on the south, Ventura Boulevard in the north, Beverly Boulevard in the east, and the Pacific Ocean on the west. That is a separate planet. It has its own culture. It has its own language.
It does.
And I don't live there, and I haven't visited there in a very long time. So my answer to your question is, I have no idea.
That was a good answer.
If I did, I would tell you. If I did, I would tell you. I can tell you that the revolving door of executives in the motion picture and television business never stops turning. And nobody knows what's going to happen. The one constant is money. People would ask me over the years, about specific films. Well, how did this even get made? I could write a better film than that. And I would look at them and say, yeah, probably you could. But that has nothing to do with why this film gets made. This film got made because it secured financing, or it secured the name of a big name, a bankable star. That's how films get made. You could write the best script since Citizen Kane, and it could float around between all the studios. And if you had no track record in the industry and you didn't know anybody in the industry, film would probably never get made. On the other hand, if you happen to bump into Tom Cruise at a restaurant in Beverly Hills and give him a copy of your script, sorry, Tom, and he likes it, or anybody of that stature within the industry, film probably get made. That may not be the way it should be, but that's the way the industry has always been.
You attach a star and a director to it, and off to the races.
That's right. You don't even need the director. I mean, either way, a star or a A-list director, or of course, if you get both, then you've run the table and you're in story-wise. So a lot of bad films get made. If they make money, sequels to bad films get made. It's a money-making business. It's not about art. The art is incidental. If somebody like Martin Scorsese can make a film like Casino or Raging Bull and people call it art, it's art for Scorsese. But for the people who finance the film, all that matters is the bottom line. That's just the way it is. There used to be, within publishing, and there it still is to a certain small extent, people who would publish a book because they thought it should be published. not because they ever expected to make any money on it, but just because they thought other people should read this material. And you have small publishers today who will still do something like that. But all of the publishers now, the big publishers, are part of giant corporations. And the people who run everything now, more and more in publishing, just like in the movie business, are not the editors, they are the accountants. And everybody studies the sales readouts from Amazon every week, and to a lesser extent, Barnes and Noble, and that determines what gets published.
Alan, with regards to something you mentioned on your interview with Midnight's Edge with Tom and Andre, Finn and Ray, if it was up to you, would you have put them together romantically?
Yeah, that's the way I read it in the script. I don't invent something like that. I take what I read in the script and I see the film in my mind's eye from reading the script. And if there's not something there, I don't invent something like that because it would go against the way characters are portrayed in the script. And
Sure.
I don't do that. Everything I do with characters, as much as I might expand upon them in the book, is based on something that I've read in the screenplay. Because it's not my job to introduce something radical like that isn't there. And I saw it there. So I went gently with it because that's all I saw in the book, in the adaptation. But there was a definite attraction I saw there. And, they may not have gotten married and had kids by episode 3, but I definitely saw an attraction there that went beyond, hi, you saved my life. Let's get on with the story. And I would love to have developed that, even if it didn't in the end, as happens in many stories, go somewhere permanent. In fact, I thought that would have been the basis for a really interesting three-way relationship. You almost had that in the original Star Wars before we found out that Luke and Leia were brother and sister. There was that
love triangle.
Exactly. I saw that. I saw that in The Force Awakens, and nothing happened.
I thought it was a really wasted opportunity what they did with Finn, a stormtrooper that goes rogue and joins the rebellion. What an incredible curve that could have been throughout those 3 films. Absolutely wasted.
Agree with you completely. And it was there. Abrams put it there and it just went nowhere. And we can speculate on all sorts of reasons, as people have, why it went nowhere. But then, the whole story went nowhere in the next film anyway, so probably didn't really matter. But as a writer, reading the screenplay, that's what I saw. Even if it was not the intention of the director, people who participated in writing the screenplay, I saw it there, and that's why I put it in the book. And I thought it was natural. I didn't invent anything. It was right there. And I thought, well, what a lovely thought. Here's this gal who doesn't know anything about her background in life, but who's a pretty tough gal. Here's, as you say, this rogue stormtrooper who possibly on second thought, hey, this was a bad decision. I shouldn't have done this. I'm a dead man now. Those are 2 interesting characters. You put them together in that situation, all kinds of interesting story possibilities. And it just did not happen.
Alan, you obviously there are some people you and I know in common as well regarding to this question, but this is not specific to any one person. Since I started the YouTube channel, I've met a lot of young writers who felt that they need to work on somebody else's IP in order to make themselves a professional. Can you be a young writer and go with something original, or do you have to go and work on somebody else's IP?
Not only do I think you have to be original, I think that's the way to go. What I have run into in my experience is a lot of young writers can't seem to make that break. They say, well, this is a Star Wars story. I want to write this Star Wars story. I want to write this Star Trek story. I want to write this alien story. I want to write this Fast and Furious story. And what I tell them is, okay, if that's the only way you can do it, go ahead and write it that way. Then go back, change the names to protect the innocent, change the backgrounds, make it look as un-Star Wars or Star Trek or alien-like as you can, and hey presto, you'll have an original novel. Because that is, to a certain extent anyway, what publishers are still looking for. And you'll have a much better chance of bringing notice to yourself and selling something if you do that. Because if you're going to write a Star Wars novel or a Star Trek novel uninvited, there is no reason for a publisher to hire you, or excuse me, to buy your book, because they already have a whole stable of writers who have proven successes writing in these franchises. Why should they buy your story? So go ahead and write a Star Wars story if you want, and then go through and change things and make it non-Star Wars. People may read it and say, well, this is just like Star Wars, but it will be an original work by you that has a much better chance of getting noticed. The other thing I tell them is, even though there is a dearth of markets these days, this is not 30s and 40s when there were 8 zillion pulp magazines around as markets for new short story writers. Write some short stories. It'll take you a lot less time to write 10 short stories than it will to write one novel. And that means you'll have 10 different chances to sell something. So I still advise young writers.
Good advice.
I have a couple of friends that are published science fiction writers. One has written 5 books that are self-published. Another has written several novellas, short stories, and a novel or two, and they can't seem to, even though they're very good, they can't seem to get representation or anything other than rejection slips. What advice would you have for people in that situation?
It's tough. All you can do is keep submitting. Don't go the self-publishing route until you have explored every possible paid, even if you don't get in advance, submission route with regular publishers. There are a lot of small publishers out there who do wonderful books, and you might end up in a situation where you don't get any money up front, but you get a percentage of sales when the book is done. That at least frees you from the onus, such as it may be, of being considered a strictly self-published writer. I've self-published. I did two stories through Amazon Publishing because they were so off kilter or offbeat for me. One involved was science fiction in a sense, involved the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and it was a novella, which is the most awkward length to sell because it can't be published generally as a book, and publishers of anthologies and magazines don't like it because they can put 4 short stories in there instead of your novella by 4 different authors. The other one was the very short biography of a young Nigerian fisher, a PHI, scammer, in other words, who, long story, how we got involved. He's currently living in the United States. I helped him get a visa and is doing very well out of New York and Atlanta. I'm not going to mention his name because he told me a lot of things that are in the book, which is co-published by me and him as under an alias, because he's afraid his friends back in Lagos or Abuja might come looking for him. But that was an interesting project to be on. So I did both of those as self-publishing, and I get a couple of bucks from Amazon every 3 months. And that's fine because there was no other market for something like that by me, because you do tend to get categorized, as you all well know. So there's that. But by all means, explore any formal publishing route besides self-publishing as you can. As to how to break that, all you can do is keep doing it and hope that an established publisher, be they big or small, notices your work. I get sent stuff all the time, not just by beginning writers, but by best-selling writers, by names you would recognize, usually not from the author themselves, but from their publisher, who are looking for blurbs. My eyes got very bad, started getting very bad for reading more than 20 years ago. So I have to restrict my reading time, ironic as this is, to research and keeping up with current events, professionals. But I did read one book, which I called The Elephant Queen. Big book, very well written, by the brother of a guy we knew very well, because he had lived in Afghanistan and Thailand for a long time. Last name is Soderbergh. And it was about basically drug running in Myanmar and Thailand. I thought it was terrific. I so much so that I did something I've never done before, which was send it to one of my publishers with a recommendation saying you ought to publish this. But it didn't happen. My recommendation wasn't enough. The quality of the book, which he self-published, wasn't enough. So sometimes, even with help, you can't get things done. I get stuff all the time like that. And what little of it I can manage to read, please don't send me anything. What little of it I can manage to read, sometimes, usually is either not well written or not commercial enough. But sometimes, like with a book like The Elephant Queen, I get something that's terrific that I think is much better than the general run-of-the-mill fiction that's out there. And it still doesn't sell. It's really difficult. It's becoming more and more in publishing the equivalent of what we just talked about with the film industry, where you really have to know somebody, or you have to have, and even then it doesn't matter sometimes.
It really seems like 90% of the things you see on a book stand are crap or garbage.
Well, that's Sturgeon's law. 90%, Theodore Sturgeon's law, 90% of everything is crap.
Yeah.
And sometimes it becomes trends. Certain things are trendy right now, even within science fiction and fantasy. Don't need to go into detail. I know a lot of the people who write it. I see the heads nodding. You all know people who write it. I had a wonderful editor one time, Brian Thompson, who died way too young, tragically young. And we were having lunch one time in New York when I used to go to New York to talk to people. And he said, the target audience for science fiction is 14-year-old boys, because that's when the imagination gets kicked up. That was his opinion. And that's what he bought for, I think. Bought a number of my books. But that target audience seems to have changed, at least in the mind of publishers. And in a way, it's a good thing, because the audience now for science fiction, and I'm not talking about fantasy, which is a whole different thing, but science fiction has changed, and for the better. You have a lot more diversity, but I feel that story comes first, and diversity is not a reason for writing or publishing a book. If it's a good book and it's not diverse, it should be published. If it's a good book and it happens to be diverse, so much the better. That's the way it should have been all along. The field has changed, society has changed, and I think it's great to see. I got two things from Poul Anderson, who was a wonderful early writer, and who Joanne and I got to meet several times. And I got two things from Poul that I really didn't encounter much from other science fiction writers that made so much sense to me that I immediately adopted them for my work. One was, all of his stories, the characters use the metric system. Of course, I'd grown up in the US, all I knew was the English system. I thought, well, that's so obvious. We're going to have a galactic empire that uses feet and miles. That doesn't make any sense. So I immediately adapted, unless the story demanded otherwise, the metric system in all of my stories. The other one was, he had a diverse range of characters. He had characters who were from all over the world and had different cultural backgrounds, even though he was talking hundreds of years in the future. And I thought, well, this is obvious. This is the way it should be. We're going to do a story about a galactic empire centered on Earth, and everybody talks like they're from Topeka. This doesn't make any.
I happen to be 35 miles away from Topeka.
Yeah, I was going to say, Lawrence, doesn't make any sense. We're going to have to abandon tribalism and have a world government of some kind and a world society of some kind, or it's not going to work. You're not going to have, six solar systems run by the United States, and 3 run by the African Union, and 4 run by Mercosur out of South America. That's just not the way it's going to work. It doesn't work in stories. It doesn't make any sense. So I got those 2 wonderful things from Poul Anderson. And that's the way science fiction is becoming more and more today, thank goodness. But it is not the sole reason for publishing a story. just my take.
Another
I think-
question I wanted to ask you, do you have any feelings one way or the other about the sad puppies, rabid puppies situation?
Um, can I get in trouble here? I think I'm already in trouble just by saying, can I get in trouble? Look, good story comes first. If it's a good story, that trumps everything as far as I'm concerned. It's a bad story, shouldn't be published and should be criticized as such. Awards are a whole separate thing from the publishing industry. They shouldn't be, but they are. And you get a lot of people who vote for awards, who've obviously, hopefully read the stories. And then you get people who read a lot of stories who don't vote for the awards. And if the people who are going to bitch about certain books or certain stories winning an award for a certain reason don't bother to buy memberships in the groups that do the voting, then they have no complaint. If you don't like the way the awards are being awarded, then get you and your friends to please read the books first, read the stories first, and then vote. Otherwise, just buy the books, or go to the movies, or play the games, and enjoy them. And you can't, you have no right to say anything. It's no different from an election for political office. You know, how did so-and-so get elected? I don't understand it. She doesn't make any sense. And then it's like, did you vote? Well, no, I was busy that day. Then you have no right to complain.
Yeah.
I tried to get involved. There was one website, female-oriented website. I just happened to find myself on it one time. I tried to get involved in this discussion for obvious reasons. And there were 2 or 3 gals, because it was all gals, or 95% gals, who tried to discuss it rationally with me. And then there was a lot of sound and fury. And what turned me off the whole thing one time permanently was I like N.K. Jemison's writing. It's fantasy. I think it's fantasy. It's not science fiction, at least what I've read. And she won 3 Hugos in a row. I think that's great for her. She's a good writer. But I was getting involved in this discussion, and I wrote, this one gal and I were going back and forth, and I said, so do you think Jemison's trilogy is better than everything that's been written by Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke, because they never won 3 Hugos in a row? She wrote back and said yes, with several exclamation points afterwards. And at that point, I saw the discussion wasn't going anywhere. You can put things in a historical context or a cultural context. Fortunately, Ms. Jemison is a good writer. If she was a bad writer, then I'd have a lot of problems with this. But she's a good writer. And even though I prefer science fiction and fantasy, I've written both and I've read both. But if people are going to argue from that basis, from a lack of knowledge about history and the history of the genre, then you can't go anywhere with it. And I just broke off the whole discussion. And I felt bad for the other couple of gals, 2, 3 gals, who were trying to have a rational discussion with me about the subject. And it just couldn't. I don't have enough time for it. My personal situation doesn't allow for it. And I'll leave it to younger, more energetic people to deal with that. It is what it is. And the only thing I can say in conclusion is that history will judge. You know, what works, I think you have to be dead for at least 100 years as a creative person before there can be a valid artistic analysis of your work anyway. True for art, true for music, true for writing. So maybe somebody in 22, 21 will look back and say, well, these are the books we value from 100 years ago. I mean, how many people can name the Nobel Prize winner for literature for 1905? You don't see it. The only reason I happen to know that was a book called Quo Vadis, which got made into a very big Hollywood film. Polish writer named Henryk Sienkiewicz wrote a great trilogy, terrific trilogy of books. The first one was With Fire and Sword, and one was called Pan Michael. Nobody reads these books today, unless I guess you're studying European literature of that era or Polish literature. They're terrific books. I put them up against any historical adventure fiction that's being written today. But they just, even though the guy won a Nobel Prize, they just disappear from the general consciousness. So I won't be around. People say, "Don't you worry about your legacy as a writer?" And I'm like, no. You know, Melville couldn't get, except in England a little bit, the United States couldn't get real recognition for Moby Dick. People wanted him to write more travelogues type storybooks like Typee and Omu, which made him a success. Instead, he comes up with this, you know, what's this book about whaling and crazy captain and all of that? No, nobody's going to read that. And so, you know, that appreciation has changed for that particular book and Melville as a whole, but it took time. And it takes time. So I don't worry about it.
I want to welcome Tom, our friend Tom Connors. I think from Midnight's Edge. Can you hear us, Tom?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you for joining us, Tom.
How you doing, Alan? Been a while.
Yeah, we're still using Zoom because I still can't use StreamYards.
Well, you remember.
Oh, yes, I remember. That's why I mentioned it to PJ. That's why I mentioned I have a good memory for certain things.
That's great to hear. So I'm glad to hear the quote unquote good news. I haven't been brought up to date as far as everything that's happened, but I apologize for coming in late.
I have no comment on that. First thing I have no comment on through the whole discussion.
It's just good that you're here now.
Yes.
Alan, I have a question for you, which is more for as you as a futurist than as a sci-fi author. I think you're uniquely qualified to answer this question. Are you familiar with the made-up language of Esperanto?
Sure.
What now?
If you search languages on Google, it's the one you're going to hit by accident because it's right below English.
Are you, as an evolutionary concept, you know, as an evolutionary direction for humankind, this made-up imposed language, does it? Because I've heard a lot of sci-fi authors, you know, dabble with this. Does it make any sense for humanity to adopt something like this, or is it just too ideal thinking?
I think it makes
idealistic.
I think it makes sense, but I think Esperanto is too idealistic. You can't impose something like that on people. It has to happen naturally. It happened with Spanish hundreds of years ago, and it's happening right now, and it's happened for a while with English. Whether you agree with the reasons for it happening or not. I was in Stockholm one time and I was talking to a Swedish businessman, and I said, who did a lot of business in Norway, I said, when you're in Norway, do you speak Norwegian or do you speak Swedish? And he said, neither one, we speak English. And so English has become the lingua franca of business and of entertainment currently, despite the fact that there are far more people speaking Mandarin. Mandarin is a difficult language. It's difficult to pronounce, and it's difficult traditionally to write. Someone would say, well, what about India? There are more people in India. But in India, they speak dozens of different languages. And in fact, the entertainment business, you find films in Hindi and Tamil and other languages as well. I don't think Mandarin is a legitimate competitor for English as a world language because of its difficulty. And Hindi is not because it's only one language. It simply has spread around the world as a convenient thing to use. It's like mathematics in a way. Everybody uses the same kind of math. If you go anywhere in the world and you're looking to do business, you have to speak some English. As usual, I've spent time in more than 100 countries. And if there's one thing I've learned over half a century of traveling to all those countries, it's that money trumps everything. And if you're going to do business and make money, you have to speak some English. I don't care if you're in Africa or South America or any place else. China is a special exception because the population is so large. But even within China, there are issues with making Mandarin a universal language. You go to Hong Kong and people want to speak Cantonese. They don't want to speak Mandarin. So it's still an issue there. And the longer English becomes the language of business and entertainment, the more widely it will spread. And I don't think Esperanto as a made-up language would be an issue. I think English will be around for at least a long time as the closest thing we have to a world language. It would be a lot better if some of the pronunciation was fixed, and particularly if some of the spelling was fixed. Spelling in English, a lot of it doesn't make any sense because it's not phonetic. If English was entirely phonetic, I don't think there would be any question it would become a permanent world language. But as long as you're going to have two words like through and through, you're going to have problems. But at this point, it's the best thing we have.
It seems to me like the example from The Expanse, the Belter Creole, which is derived from Russian and Japanese and English and so many different languages, might become sort of the language of the future, so to speak, as PJ was asking. Do you agree with that?
The interesting thing about English is that it's very adaptable, and it has no problems with other people throwing words from their own language into English and vice versa. English loves to adapt new languages. I was older before I realized that chauffeur was not an English word. Things like that. And unlike, the French, which has the Academy, which tries to preserve the French language, when they're not working on the weekend, when it's adaptable like that and flexible like that, we don't have an academy like they do in France to preserve the purity of the French language. We don't have that for English. English is a bastard language. We'll take anything and throw it into English and vice versa. You see that in India, where you have a lot of Hindu terms thrown in, and in Japan, and all over the world. So I don't think we're going to have something made up like that. Russian is almost as difficult as Chinese. I think so. That's why I don't think that sort of thing's going to happen. Of course, we can't predict hundreds of years in the future what language, what economy will become dominant. Whatever the dominant economic situation is, you're going to have the dominant language.
I just want to take a second and acknowledge our sponsor for today, the Fandom Collective, Flip. Welcome, Flip, and Paulie from Latino Slants. Hello, welcome, Flip and Paulie.
Hello,
Thank you.
good day.
Thank you. It's good to
It's a pleasure and an honor, sir, Mr. Foster.
My pleasure. As PJ can tell you, I have no problem talking.
I would like
None of us here do.
I would like one of the three who just came in to maybe ask the next question, since we've been here for a while. If not, I have the next question already. If you don't have one,
Please, PJ.
okay. Alan, you kind of touched upon this, but Gap Stargate was asking this in the chat, and I combined his question and my question. What's wrong with sci-fi today, and where do you think it's going to go?
Mentioned about my eyes being bad for reading. I have unfortunately not been able to keep up with current science fiction developments and publishing as much as I would like to, because my brain wants to, my heart wants to, but my eyes won't let me do it. So I can't speak to that really. Now, as far as cinematic science fiction, it's really a mixed bag. And it may be a mixed bag that's erring on the side of good things. Because while we have a little bit of everything, we have general space opera like Guardians of the Galaxy, which I thought was wonderful and enjoyed the heck out of, even though from a science standpoint makes no sense. We have something like The Mandalorian, which is much more of a direction that obviously I think every fan will agree with me Star Wars should go in, as opposed to, Skywalkers have had their turn in the sun and in the dark, and Mandalorian's the way that should go. And then we have finally more serious science fiction appearing in theaters. I already mentioned Arrival, which is a wonderful film. which interestingly is based on a science fiction story by somebody who writes science fiction, Ted Chiang. And Annihilation, based on a book by work by Jeff Vandermeer. And we're going to see Dune, which I'm going to make a drive, which I haven't done since Aliens, to go see in IMAX. I have to drive down to Phoenix, which directed by the same gentleman, Denis Villeneuve, who did Arrival. And we're going to see Foundation. And I thought the Sci-Fi Channel did a decent job with a really difficult to adapt book called Childhood's End, which many fans who read it think maybe is sometimes voted the best science fiction book of all time. Whether you accept that or not, difficult to do. So we're going to see Foundation. So we're seeing more real science fiction. You mentioned The Expanse, an obvious choice. And so I have a lot of hope. The main development that's happened there is it's now possible to show on screen concepts, science fictional concepts that were not possible to show on screen as recently really as 50 years ago. And that's due to the development of computer special effects. There's a series on Netflix called Life, Death, and Robots.
Yeah, I love that.
Series, animation, but there's some extraordinary developments in CGI, and this has happened so fast, people almost can't keep up with it, where it really does start to seriously blur the line between live action and computer animation. And that makes possible things that were, not possible as recently as I mentioned. So I have great hopes for film science fiction. If people will go see these things or subscribe to the channels that show them, then the economics will be there. And even though the people who may be far behind them, working in accounting, let's say, will be willing to finance more of it. That may not be the way we want it to go, but we'll start to see things like that happen. So I have great hopes for that. As far as literary science fiction, there seem to be some trends at the moment. I don't write the trends at the moment. I never have. I write what I write, and if people want to buy it, they'll find it. They'll seek it out. Before we go away, which doesn't need to be immediately, but I want to mention, since there have been a lot of questions involving novelizations and film TV adaptations, it occurred to me that I'm not going to live to be 120, and that people may want to have the answers to the same questions in 40 or 50 or 100 years or whatever, and I ought to jot them down. I didn't take notes when I was doing this, but I mentioned I have a decent memory. And everything I could recall about working on these projects will be out in a book called The Director Should Have Shot You, from Centipede Press.
Nice.
From Centipede Press. The books are being printed now. The book is compiled and ready, and it's actually being printed, and will be out next month.
Next month.
Fantastic.
So anybody has questions that don't get answered, you can buy the book, and it's all in there. The book is illustrated. And hopefully, if you have a question about a specific film that I did the book adaptation of, you'll find the answer in that book. It starts with Luana, it goes all the way up through Alien Covenant.
The editor should have shot you.
Yes.
Okay.
No, the
I do have a
director.
question.
The director. Gotcha. Okay.
And that's answered in the book too, where the title came from.
Hey, Alan, I have a question. So as a creative person, with everything that's going on in real life with Mars, we went there again with Perseverance. The Ingenuity just flew yesterday. And, Elon Musk is heading there. Does any of this inspire you to go in a direction that takes your science fiction to Mars?
No, I remember when we had the first moon landing, and reporters were asking science fiction fans and readers and writers what they thought of it, and the general reaction was, what took so long? Because the writing had been so many steps ahead of the actuality for so many years and decades. And it's the same way with me about Mars. One thing that I do think is good about it is I think people in the film business realize you can't adapt certain things now because you can't fool 10-year-old kids. You can't show six-armed Martians riding around on thoats on Mars because every 10-year-old kid has seen pictures from Mars and knows that that's not what it's like. It doesn't really inspire me. There are writers who, I miss Ben Bova for this, for example, used to pick up on this sort of thing all the time, but it's not what I write. But as a lover of science as well as science fiction, to see something like Ingenuity rise into the air on another world and then set down, it's all I could think of was, that looks like a kid's toy. That looks like I'm looking for the rubber band that makes it fly. Used to have these little Ballwood planes with rubber bands. And yet we're seeing, and never mind that we're seeing a craft flying on another planet, we're seeing pictures being transmitted back to Earth of the craft flying on another planet. I just hope I stick around long enough to see something similar fly on Titan.
Yes.
And something get into the oceans on Europa. It's like, you look for reasons when you get to be my age with my physical and health condition, you look for reasons to stick around. Science fiction and science fictional things that are happening now, those are reasons to stick around. I'm as curious about those things now as I ever was about anything in the universe. That's one of the reasons I started writing science fiction. So I could go to these places that don't exist, or if they exist, we don't know about them, and visit them and take other people along with me. That's why so much of my science fiction is far future and set on other worlds that I get to go visit. So I keep telling people Mars looks just like Yuma, but it's still a more interesting place.
Yeah. Thank you.
Alan, what original work of yours do you want to see on screen?
Well, I would say Midworld, but that's not likely to happen. But aside from that, and speaking strictly of the science fiction works, because there are other works I would like to see on screen too. Well, I'll mention them too. The biggest book I ever wrote is a historical novel called Maori, which is set in 19th century New Zealand, which I think would make a really nice miniseries. It's actually in 6 parts, so it's structured like a miniseries. There's that. There's a book I wrote set in contemporary New Guinea called Primal Shadows. But speaking from a science fiction viewpoint, it's difficult for me to pick. There's one book that I would love to see done, and I'd love to see it done in India by an Indian production company called Sagramanda, which is set in near future India and has a rather varied, large cast of characters. One of which is there's a man-eating tiger, and there's a crazy French woman who's a devotee of Kali. And there's a father who's trying to hunt down and kill his son for marrying a Dalit, an untouchable woman. Whoops. That's new. Did someone touch something?
No, I'm sharing a picture of you in Morocco. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, the resolution isn't real great, at least at my end, but this is on the road over the Atlas Mountains. This is a trip I took. I usually go by myself, since my wife can't travel anymore, but this was a trip I took a few years ago with a wonderful artist named James Gurney, who you may know from the Dinotopia books. Prior to that, Jim did covers for like half a dozen of my books. And this is one of the places we went was Morocco. We rented a car in Casablanca and kind of took off. Jim speaks pretty good French. I speak a little Arabic. And between the two of us, we thought we could get along okay. Not that every tourist person in Morocco doesn't speak English, but it was a lot more fun speaking French and Arabic. And this is on the road over the Atlas Mountains, over into the Sahara. And there's a junction there, as you can probably make out. You go to my right, you go to Marrakesh. You go to my left, you go to Ouarzazate. In Ouarzazate, they didn't at the time, I think the largest solar installation in Morocco, if not in all of North Africa. At that time, you had to go to an internet cafe to access the internet at all. There's a very famous old town there, which has been in many movies, used as a film set. And if you go to the outskirts of Warzazat, and if you're going by yourself, which is the way to go, I don't know if any tour buses went to Warzazat, but if you follow the road through Warzazat and keep going, the pavement peters out in the Sahara, and the next sign says Timbuktu. And I just thought that was so cool. If you're an adventurous person, that's great. We didn't try to drive to Timbuktu because we didn't have the right vehicle for it, and we didn't have enough time. But it was great just seeing the road die in the sands of the Sahara. Then we turned around and went on the eastern side of the Atlas Mountains and drove all the way up and came back through Fez. And it was a great trip. It was a great trip.
And I didn't mean to interrupt what you were telling us before, Alan, about India, but I wanted to show people about your travels. And I also did want to ask you, speaking about Africa, do you have any thoughts on what the Eye of Africa might be? Are you familiar with
the Eye of Africa? No, you've stumped.
Okay, it's a formation.
Massive geometric formation. It's just a big circle. Some people have hypothesized that it may be where Atlantis was, an old lake.
Now, it's obviously a natural geologic formation. It just happens to be a really interesting, isolated one. Geologic formations like that, Ayers Rock is another one, just fascinate people who immediately start looking for supernatural or extraterrestrial explanations for them. And when they do that, I refer them to Carl Sagan's comment, which is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary
evidence.
So, no, I know.
And if we can't figure it out, it must be aliens.
Obviously, it's alien. How else to explain Donald Trump's election? Sorry, that was too easy.
Alan,
There's so many things I could have said right there, but
And me too.
very funny, Mr. Foster. I love it.
Alan, with regards to, are you familiar with what the fandom calls the fandom menace regarding the group of fans who were they began to be extremely upset about Star Wars Episode 8, and then they were, they kind of rebelled against Star Trek and other franchises who were going into this modern era, this trend of putting politics and platforms into sci-fi instead of story. Sure. Do you have any thoughts on the fandom trying to unite in such a way?
Look, you can complain, you can criticize, or you can raise money and make your own movie, obviously outside of those franchises. But this has always been the case with art, all the way back through history. One of the greatest pieces of music written in the 20th century, I and others think, is Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Okay, there was a riot at the premiere between people who thought it was the greatest breakthrough in music that they'd heard at that time, and people thought it wasn't music at all. And they were outraged. There was an actual riot. Didn't change the course of music. The riot didn't. Stravinsky continued to write what he wanted to write, and people continued to listen to whatever they thought music should be, or their particular form of music. Everybody has the right to express their views. Everybody's a critic, as the old saying goes. But if you want to form a pressure group, that certainly is your right. The only thing that will change the course of those films, since we're talking specifically about films, is whether or not they make money or don't make money. If they make money, they will continue to be made in that fashion. If they start to die at the box office, when we have a box office again, and we will, then they won't be made in that fashion anymore. If you're not in a position to influence them directly and you want to start a letter writing campaign, letter writing campaigns can have a lot of success. There's no reason to get vile and violent about it. It doesn't do anything, and it doesn't impress the people that you're trying to persuade. I'll have this argument involving all kinds of things with people about everything from politics to science to vaccinations to all sorts of contemporary things. And I'll say, look, do you want to vent your spleen or do you want to persuade somebody? And if you're just going to yell and scream, you're not going to persuade anybody of anything. And it's not good for your blood pressure, and it breaks down proteins in your body. And sometimes this kind of argument will have some success with people. The thing I found, because I've been asked to go into politics, I've been asked to run for Congress twice in the
Really?
40 years we've lived here in Prescott. One time was very early because, believe it or not, Central Arizona was even more conservative than it is now. But the first time I was asked, I went to Joanne and I said, what do you think? I have a degree in political science also. And she said, if you go into politics, first I'll kill you, then I'll divorce you. So that was pretty much the end of that, although I did serve on the Planning and Zoning Commission here for a couple of years. And what I learned was that there are certain people you can persuade of certain things, and there are certain people you will never be able to persuade. And if you try persuading the latter group, you're wasting your time. You're much better off spending it on people who will listen to you. The other thing is, all of these people, be they rational and logical, or like the guy who stood up at a town hall meeting when Senator John McCain was here in Prescott and spent 10 minutes expostulating on the secret Russian base on the dark side of the moon that was beaming radiation at us. Didn't bother to point out how if he was on the dark side of the moon, this was happening because you couldn't see Earth. And McCain let him go. For the whole, people were starting to shout in the audience, sit down or be quiet. And McCain said, no, let him speak. Raised my John McCain in my estimation quite a bit. Those people, you're never going to persuade of anything. So there's no point wasting your time. And that goes for opinions about science fiction films as well. If you want to change things, try to be logical and rational. When people ask me about episode 8, that's what I try to do. Usually they just take my response when I say that was a terrible film. It was a bad film. It was a terrible Star Wars film. I've said this over and over again. And then people will say, if they're reasonable people, they'll say, instead of saying, yeah, you're right, we agree with you, they'll say, well, why do you think that? And you have to be able to back it up. So that's the approach I usually try to take.
And just on that, Alan, you have now that you just brought that up, you got zero response for your treatment script, right?
No, I got a lot of response.
Oh, you did?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. What people forget is that treatment was written after I saw episode 8 and was an attempt to retcon episode 8 for an episode 9. It was not necessarily what I would have written had I been given the opportunity to write episode 8. And a lot of people made that mistake. If I had been given the opportunity to write, say, episode 8, I would not have written that treatment. I would have written something very different. But that was an attempt to fix, as a fan and as a writer, what I saw as a lot of the major mistakes that were made in episode 8 for proposed episode 9. Then episode 9 came out and the whole thing was moot. But I did that for the fans. It's like, okay, if I had a chance to do an episode 9, bearing in mind that episode 8 exists and cannot be made to go away, this is along the lines what I would have written.
And I apologize. What I meant to say was that the response from Lucasfilm or Disney was not there,
Oh,
right?
No. In fact, my agent tried to get that treatment to Disney. I tried to get it directly to J.J. Abrams at a Star Wars get-together in Orange County, in Los Angeles, or in Orange County, I guess is where it was held. And as far as I know, I gave it to a guy who said he could get it to J.J. As far as I know, he never saw it. And if he did, wouldn't have made any difference. They can't do that. They have to be very careful. Once they say they've looked at your material, then if something, however minor from that material should show up by coincidence, even in the finished product, then they're technically liable for saying, somebody will come along. This happens in the film business all the time and say, well, the janitor who was on this project read my treatment while he was working on your film, and this taxi cab color showed up in your film, and obviously that's a steal, that's plagiarism. So they either have to They either have to acknowledge it and give you credit and probably money, or they can't say they looked at it at all. And the latter is what happens.
Is the treatment available online somewhere, Alan?
Sure. It's somewhere on my website, and I published it as one of my monthly updates. I do a usually very short, concise monthly update of what I'm doing on my website. It's on the front page. Just click on updates, and then you can scroll down through all of them. It's there, and it's been reproduced. I said people are welcome to reproduce it wherever they want.
I will
so
put a
it's
link
around.
to it.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah, very good.
it's an attempt to fix things like, Leia floating in space and the absurdity of having a ship. Well, we could go on and on about this if people have.
Yes.
A ship destroying an entire fleet by jumping to light speed through it. And if you do that, as many fans have pointed out, all you need to destroy an opposing fleet is an old freighter equipped to go to light speed. It's not just a Star Wars problem. It's like in Star Trek Into Darkness, where Scotty invents this thing that looks like an old Electrolux vacuum cleaner and says, this can let you go anywhere in the galaxy. And if you have something like that, well, then Starfleet becomes obsolete. We don't need the Enterprise or any other ships. And it becomes very boring series transportation-wise. These are things that don't get thought through when the film is in pre-production, or somebody thinks of it but is too afraid to bring it up, or they bring it up and it gets shot down. And I run into this all the time when I'm doing the novelizations. With The Force Awakens as an example, I always make these suggestions in the book. I don't say this is a suggestion, I just put it in the story, and then whoever reads it either leaves it in or says you can't do this and says take it out. And my biggest gripe, as someone interested in science with The Force Awakens, was with the Star Killer weapon, which is a silly weapon for many reasons. If you have enough energy to, draw down a piece of the sun, you've got enough energy to do whatever else you want. If you did that, it would immediately heat the planet and blow all the atmosphere off it, and on and on and on. So I thought to myself, I'm going to fix this. They'll make me take it out, but I'm going to fix it. So I did a lot of research for a novelization. And there are 2 pages in that book of highly advanced astrophysics, which probably 6 people on the planet can actually understand. I'm not one of them, but I can fake it pretty good. Attempting to describe in detail how you might actually make a planet-destroying weapon. I was sure they'd take it out, and they left it in. Now, other little minor things that I did, they made me take out. I was like, why make me take this out? I think it expands on the character. It expands on the scene. Well, we can't do that because, and the usual reason with a franchise they take that stuff out is because, God forbid, when you're making episode 13, someone will see the film and refer back to your novelization of episode 2 and saying, well, so-and-so's hair was this color instead of that color. And so studios now, where a franchise is involved, will preemptively take out a lot of seemingly harmless stuff because they don't want to be put in a situation of having to rationalize it or change it later on in the franchise. But as a writer, that's very frustrating.
No, that's a common thing I keep hearing is that, that's one of the reasons why they want to get rid of a lot of, legends or classic stories is because they don't want to adhere to the canon and it's too much to have to deal with and keep track of. And I can see that, that's becoming a common trait. I mean, like the Star Trek writers' room, I guarantee you most of them have not seen most of the shows. And it shows in the writing, and it's the same thing going forward in a lot of other franchises. They don't want to have to be bogged down by the minutia of what came before. And I mean, I've been told by several people, like, if you want to work at Lucasfilm or you want to work for CBS over at Star Trek, the last thing you want to do is tell them you're a fan, because they don't want to deal with that baggage. They don't want somebody sitting there telling them that, they're doing something wrong. That's the last thing they want.
I had something in The Unsettling Stars, which was an original Star Trek novel set in the Kelvin universe. It was integral to the story, and I thought it was an interesting addition. Yes, it was something I came up with that I created that made the plot work really well. I thought it was harmless. I thought it worked really well in the context of the story, but they made me take it out and they changed it in the finished book. I said, just go ahead and do whatever you want, because I did what I wanted. If you don't like it, do what you want. That's what happened. And they made me, take it out and change it for that reason. Because if they had left it in, it would have become canon, at least in the Kelvin universe. And I understood economically why they changed it, but from an artistic, literary standpoint, I didn't understand it. But I'm not in the position of creating canon for the Star Trek universe. I don't own the rights. It's not my universe. This is what you run into with every novelization. If you write these things, it's not your universe. It's somebody else's universe. The screenwriters, the studios, it's not yours. It's a work for hire. And if you're not prepared to deal with a situation like that repeatedly, then you shouldn't take the job.
I'm curious, Alan, if you agree with me on this, that my feeling is that, especially with modern Star Trek, like Star Trek Discovery, that there shouldn't be a writer's room at all. When we were dealing with the original series, one person would write a story and then it would get accepted, rejected. Then Gene and his people, Dorothy Fontana, et cetera, would sort of massage it into shape and it would be, put into production. Do you agree with the idea that modern Star Trek shouldn't even have a writer's room?
No, because I do believe in canon and maintaining canon. When George was just getting started, he had one person who did this. Person would come in 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and their job was to do nothing but try to maintain canon, even as going so far as to make sure that cups that were designed for McDonald's with Star Wars characters looked right and agreed with stuff in the film. I'm a big believer in canon. Whether you want to adopt it or not, that's up to the owners of the property. Also, there was no internet in those days. So you didn't have a fan in Zagreb pointing out mistakes that were or things that were non-canon in your $150 million film. Studios just don't have time for that. Rightly or wrongly, from a writing or a creative standpoint, they just don't have time for that. But they do want stuff to be canon so that people will look at the next film and say, I remember that from the first film, that looks right. Or if Kenner Toys is making a toy, they want to make sure that looks right and agrees with all the films. What happens is when a franchise gets enormous, like Star Wars or Star Trek, and certain lesser franchises, even Aliens, for example, or Alien, then you run into that problem. You have to be prepared to cope with it or not. And the only way you can cope with it, sort of having an intelligent supercomputer that can keep track of all this stuff, is to have something like a writer's room. From a creative standpoint, leave me alone. Let me do what you hired me to do, or don't hire me. And afterwards, we'll discuss what you want to change. You can change anything you want because you own that right. As a writer, I feel like you do. When I was doing Terminator Salvation, there were so many changes coming through on that film as the film was in production. It was impossible to keep up with them. And in fact, I got a rather plaintive letter from the publisher after I had turned in the manuscript for the book and had it accepted and been paid, saying they made a few more changes to the film. Could you possibly look over the latest script and maybe incorporate them in the manuscript? And I could have said no. I've been paid, mine had been accepted, but having a responsibility to the fans, to the readers, who are going to plunk down their $7.95 or whatever for this book, I felt I should do that. And what I found was, I never should have done it. What I found was the film had changed so much already that there were places that didn't make any sense in my book anymore. So I went through over a weekend and basically rewrote the book so that everything I could manage in the book would actually accord with the finished film. And they still made changes after that. I did not have to do that. I did that for the readers. So as a writer, I feel the way you do about it. If I were running the studio, I'd have to feel that way about it.
Right.
Tom, before you need to go, is there anything you want to go ahead and ask Alan?
No, not particularly. I mean, I don't want to turn around and ask something that's already been asked, and I got a chance to talk to him on our channel. So no, I want to give the rest of you guys a chance to talk. Outside of that, it's just always a pleasure to get to hear the stories and your insights and your experiences and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm glad that we got this chance to hear you.
Again, my pleasure.
Alan, I have a follow-up for an episode 8 question. Much the way Yoda was kind of testing Luke at the beginning in The Empire Strikes Back, and he was being goofy and stuff. Can Luke's behavior with Rey and in their isolated environment on that island, can it be explained by Luke testing Rey?
Well, you can rationalize anything, but from a story standpoint, no. If you were going to test Rey, I'd do it differently. Since you ask, I'd do it similar to the way Yoda tested Luke. But you need more time. You just have to have the way I handled that in my treatment for episode 9, without going into detail for it, was I said basically Rey was abandoned on the planet because she had a serious physical problem, mental problem, and she was given a partial cybernetic brain as the only way to cure it. And that was to make a long treatment short, that was my explanation for how she suddenly was able to acquire all these abilities. And some fans relating to an earlier question you asked said, well, Alan made Rey a droid. They'd make her a droid. She had a cybernetic prosthesis. And I also thought that would be cool, is letting her, be kind of simpatico with the real droids. Because she had an implant basically, which is really interesting because we're doing that with people now. You actually have experiments going on that show that people who are totally paralyzed can control a cursor on a computer screen through brainwaves.
It goes all the way back to the Terminal Man.
Yeah, or a prosthetic arm, just by thinking about it. So that doesn't make them droids. It just means they have a prosthesis. So I gave her a prosthesis. I didn't make her a droid. No, I would have done training. I wouldn't have had the training that way. In fact, I wouldn't have necessarily had a whole training sequence, because Luke would have figured out that she had this prosthesis and he would have proceeded in an entirely different fashion with her. But
And this would have explained her Mary Sue character.
Yes, exactly. In the best way I could find to explain it, being that episode 8 existed, the way it did. You're going to throw boulders around suddenly at the end of the episode. There has to be a way to explain that other than saying, well, she's a Mary Sue.
Yeah.
So I did it the way, never expecting anybody would see it, and nobody did, but I did it anyway. So.
And knowing our friend Alan has a great desire to be a Borg someday. Can you see this image, Alan?
Yes, I can see it. Fan art's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Our friend Yitza drew Alan as a cyborg as a gift to you, Alan.
Hail Yitza.
That's
Hail
really
Yitza.
That's really nice. Not only that, I don't have more hair, but I just looked at the top of it. But no, I have no problem with that. I mean, if I've got something that goes wrong with me and you can give me a mechanical thing to fix it, the flesh is weak, titanium is strong, I'm up for it. I don't know that I need the smoking gun, but I'll take the whiter teeth. And, no, I'm up for all that. That's the way we're headed. Actually, the way we're headed is, if people ask this question, well, what do you think about, an artificial arm, artificial this? What we need to do is study certain creatures more and learn how to tell our own cells to regenerate the parts of our body that aren't working. There's no reason to have an artificial arm if you can just tell the cells involved to regenerate your arm. That's the ideal solution.
Tell the telomeres not to get any smaller.
Yeah, that works too. And live a little bit longer, but this is more fun. This is more exciting. I did a trilogy of books called the Tipping Point Trilogy, where we deal with the idea that basically you'll be able to walk into a shop and get whatever kind of a prosthesis you want. And this will kill certain things. If everybody can weigh 450 pounds and run the 40-yard dash in 4 seconds flat, that'll change football. If everybody can get, multiple vocal cords, that'll change singing. And this is going to happen. I see this happening. But anyway, it was a fun series of books to write, and it's a nice piece
Alan.
of paper. Thank you very much. I do look younger in that. I'm always up for that.
Do you think that the singularity is coming? That the Ray Kurzweil's idea that the joining of man and machine is going to happen in a few short years?
No, I think the idea is right, but I think the time frame is way off.
He said 2024, I think.
Not going to happen. Not going to happen. We can't even get autonomous driving to work yet.
Right.
So
Or set our VCRs to not blink on 12.
well, that's fine now. We don't have that, but I think it'll happen because the prostheses will get better and better if we don't develop the regeneration process first. They may come simultaneously. One may happen before the other. I think they will both happen. I think we will develop the ability to regenerate parts of our body. And I think we will develop the ability to, if not merge in the singularity sense with machines directly, at least be able to contact them directly. So this is the difference between entertainment and science. It always bothered me that when I would watch shows like Star Trek, for example, or Star Wars, and people are pushing buttons. What you're going to have is a direct mind-machine interface where people will sit around and probably have some sort of device like a medieval snood, which people would decorate like snoods, which I think would be really pretty on the bridge, and will just sit there and think their instructions to the ship's computer or whatever computer you want. But that makes for really dull cinema if you have everybody just sitting around thinking. So we have to have things to push and things to turn and levers to push but that's not that takes the science out of the science fiction, but it's a lot more exciting from a visual standpoint.
It always made me feel a little weird as a Doctor Who fan that the Daleks spoke to one another and didn't just communicate as, robots, or the Cybermen would have to say excellent instead of just have some sort of Wi-Fi, going.
Well, that's drama. That's not science. That's drama. You have to have that. Or again, you have a very dull TV show. If your bad guys don't say anything, they just go clank clank. You can't relate to them. It's the old saw of, well, if we meet aliens, they'll be so alien we won't be able to understand them. And if we can't understand them, then you have a very dull TV show or a very dull book. The aliens speak in white lines. There's just nothing. You have to be able to relate to them.
And that's why you enjoyed Arrival so much.
Yes. Those were aliens. Their method of communication was different. Their science was different. And instead of having 2 hours of exposition, it was just put out there. It made you think, and that's what the best science fiction does. Doesn't mean you can't make science fiction that makes you jump up and down in your seat and spill your popcorn. But it makes you think. That is the big advantage that written science fiction has over filmed science fiction. In a book, you don't need all that action. It's nice to have action once in a while, but you can explore things that just make people think.
And the good science fiction that's literary based not only makes the reader think, but leaves the reader thinking about that book for a long time.
That's right. And you can do it cinematically too, but it's very difficult. Arrival being, an excellent example, 2001 being a good example. From a literary standpoint, the books of Olaf Stapledon will expand your mind like nothing else, although the writing style is a little turgid now. We're talking about books that were written 100 years ago, but you'll never see any filmed Olaf Stapleton. There was a film called Powder. Anybody remember a film called Powder?
Yep.
Powder.
Shows on, cable all the time with a great cast, which is basically, shall I say, a takeoff on Stapleton's Oddjob. Goes in some different directions, but that's basically what it is. If somebody wants to see a good low-budget film with some great acting, Mary Steenburgen's in it. It's a great little film. Runs on TV all the time. I always recommend Dark City to people. It's science fiction, a lot of action, makes you think, though. You're thinking throughout that whole film because you're not sure exactly what's going on, what's happening until the very end.
Mhm.
Try to make that film today with William Hurt, Jennifer Connelly, and Kiefer Sutherland. Never get it made. Never be able to afford the budget. That's real science fiction.
And Rufus Sewell, of course, who's
and thank
also
you
in
for-
The Man in the High Castle.
That's right.
And to me, for my money, looked exactly the same as he did in Dark City.
Well, that's genetics, and we can't manage that too well yet. So
He
Alan,
didn't seem to have aged a day.
Alan, is there anything you have ghostwritten that we would be totally blown away if we knew that you had written it?
no,
No?
answer that honestly. Everybody knows about Star Wars. It's the only book I've ever done that doesn't have my name on it. And no problem with that. It was in the contract, and that's what you do. If it's in the contract, or you don't do it. I did write a series of stories called Montezuma Strip. That's the name of the series. There are 2 novellas and 3 novelettes set in the near future on the US-Mexican border. And then there was a novel that came out after them called The Mocking Program, all from Warner Books. And those were written, the Mocking Program appeared under my name, but all the Montezuma Strip stories appeared under the name James Lawson. James Lawson being the name of my character from my favorite book by my favorite writer, science fiction writer, Eric Frank Russell. It's the name of the main character. And a book which I actually had a chance to expand upon after Russell's death for a program that Tor did, where they would match living writers with work by writers who were deceased generally, and that was a lot of fun. That book was called Designed for Great Day, based on a story by Russell called The Ultimate Invader, which was half of an ace double for those of you who have seen those, remember those. But that's it. Otherwise, I would have sometimes someone ask me, say, well, this is a little different for you. Would you like this to appear under a pseudonym? And I would say, no, I'm proud of what I wrote. Might as well put my name on it. So those are the only instances.
It reminds me of the books that were done by Bryn and Gregory Benford and the other Greg Bear on Foundation.
Okay. Yeah, it was a very similar idea. You take a classic science fiction story and give it to another writer and ask them to expand upon it, especially if it was like a novella or something like that. We could really stand expansion. And I was asked by Tom Doherty at Tor if I would be willing to participate in that program. And at first I said no. And then I thought, wait a minute, there's this very short novel, which I think is a wonderful piece of far future science fiction writing, very Stapledonish actually, called The Ultimate Invader. As far as I know, it's only appeared as half of an ace double outside of its original magazine appearance in the Pulps. If you'll let me do that one, then I'll do it. And so I got to collaborate with my favorite science fiction writer posthumously for him, and it was a great experience. And I think it turned out pretty well.
Alan, you've been so generous with your time, and thank you, my friend, for coming and hanging out with us.
Sure, it's a pleasure, particularly in these times. I mean, I don't live in LA anyway, or New York. I can't go to a club. I can't find people of like mind to talk to about things, and that's the best thing. One of the best things about the internet is that you can do stuff like this. Yes, it's wonderful to be able to look up things like the Eye of Africa if you get curious about that. But it's great to be able to talk to people too, because we can't all go meet in person. My problem is most of my friends are scattered around the planet. I mean, I have people I'd love to talk to in person in Australia, and Peru, and Hong Kong, and software like this enables us to do that, because my travel budget is not equipped for that, and society is not equipped for that right now anyway, but we're getting there.
Did you get Did you get vaccine yet, Alan?
Oh yeah, as soon as it became available here, Moderna, 2 shots. But it's frustrating. Sometimes it's just depressing. Not just politics, but there are people who don't believe in science, or they're suspicious of science, and you would think we would be beyond that by now. You would think we would be past people who think the moon landing was fake, and the Mars landing was shot in Yuma, if you will.
Capricorn 1.
Some kind of secret plot by poor Bill. Well, that's a misnomer, by Bill Gates, to control everybody through altering their DNA. I mean, you go back to what I said earlier. You try to be calm and rational with people and explain things to them. It's like the whole idea, not to go on about it. Well, the election was stolen. It was obviously stolen. And instead of going back to yelling at people saying, no, it was fair and honest, I say, well, let's explore that. How could the election have been stolen? You would have had to have X number of judges in X number of states working with X number of people at the companies that, did the electronic counting of the votes. And, you go on and on like that. So how many thousands of people would have to have been in on this secret plot, and not a single one of them decided to become a millionaire by selling their story to the New York Times or Fox or any place else? If you get people thinking that way, the bigger a conspiracy is, the harder it is to keep secret. This would have had to be one of the biggest conspiracies in modern history. Can't do it. People can't even keep, their TV preferences secret. So you have to be calm and try to explain things to people that way.
Panel, anything else you want to ask Alan before we say goodbye? Anything that you couldn't ask? Dega?
No, just some of his thoughts on, coming from my background with healthcare and everything, just the way that science would progress in the future. It would have been oddly self-serving if I had gone through a lot of that with you, because your ideas of sitting in front of any type of future device, computer, those type of things, where it'd be a direct mental interface, I think is exactly on. And I've written about some of that stuff, but for movie and that type of thing, you have to entertain. And it was just, I wanted to delve into that, but like I said, it would have been self-serving.
Well, it's hard to have an action film where everybody's just thinking of everybody else.
Right.
I mean, Guardians of the Galaxy goes away right away, and pretty much everything else does too. But yeah, that's certainly the way we're headed, and it would be fun to explore those things and talk about them. But that's a different direction from Orville Nation.
Right.
At least for an extended period of time, it would be.
I do have to say, regarding our friend Bird of Prey, who told me this morning to make sure I let everybody know that in the spirit of Disney accounting, Alan has not been paid for this interview.
No,
just a little joke. Sorry.
That's all right. I don't get paid for interviews. I'm happy to talk. As you well know, I'm delighted that people enjoy the conversation. I enjoy the conversation, even though I seem to do most of the talking. But
that's what we like about it.
Thank you. It's the human interaction. If you don't have that human interaction, I mean, Arthur C. Clarke, who was right about so many things, once wrote a story where everybody on this planet, where I think he said the ideal number of people would be 2 to 3 million, although he gave a more specific figure. And nobody ever met anybody else. There was no person-to-person contact. Everybody communicated through a means similar to what we're doing right now, with 3D generated people. I think Arthur got that one wrong. You have to have that human contact. You have to meet people. We're a gregarious species. We're not designed for that kind of isolation, except for a few individuals. And I think we need that. So yeah, it's fun to do these. It's fun to do these things, as long as my voice and my bladder hold out.
Alan,
Well-
okay, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thanks to Alan for doing this and for making the time to speak with us. It was a real thrill for me. I'm a big fanboy of your work, and I really enjoyed talking with you and engaging in conversation with you.
My pleasure. You're welcome.
Alan, before you go, can you tell us again when you visited Arthur C. Clarke? Can you tell us that story?
Okay, concluding story. I had met Arthur in London at a convention, got him to sign a couple of books. Years later, I found myself heading off to Maldives. And there's something everybody should know. It's not the Maldives. That is not how the people there refer to the country. It's like, we live in Maldives. And every political commentator, every reporter says the Maldives.
Like
Well,
Ukraine.
yeah, so now everybody knows. To go on a German dive boat with a bunch of Germans to go diving, because that was the only dive boat I could find at the time. And Maldives being very close to Sri Lanka, and knowing that Arthur lived there, knowing that it was an interesting country that I had not visited, I wrote him and said, I'm coming. Can I stop by and say hi for a day? He said, not only that, and not only would I love to see you, but please let me set up, here's where you should go, and here's who you should use. And he set up a bunch of things for me, which I was happy to let him do. And I arrived in Colombo, the capital, and checked myself into an old hotel. Once in a while, I like famous old hotels for obvious reasons, called the Force. And lo and behold, in the lobby, there is a sculpture, a bust of Arthur, who is very much an adopted native son for having lived there for so many years at the time. And got a cab finally next day out to Arthur's place, and was ushered in by a member of his extended adopted family. They helped run his scuba diving business. He had one there, which I didn't get a chance to use. And I'm ushered into Arthur's study, which is a fairly big room. All of the walls are filled with books and plaques. And, here's one signed by a bunch of Russian cosmonauts. And here's his guest book, which I'm supposed to sign, somewhere between Elizabeth Taylor and Steven Spielberg and the Duke of Windsor. It was a very nice guest book. And Arthur comes out and he's dressed in native costume, essentially. It's like a sarong type thing because it's very hot. Comfortable. He has an early computer on his desk, very impressive. This was many years ago.
Would have been an Amiga computer, I believe.
I don't remember, actually.
He was an Amiga computer fan.
I don't remember. But it was, the boxy monitor and the whole bit. Very advanced for its time. And he sat down and he said, come here, I want you to listen to something. And I'm like, I'm in Arthur Clarke's study with Arthur. There's nobody else here. I'd like to talk to you. I don't really want to listen to anything. And he says to me, did you know that H.G. Wells and Orson Welles once met? And I'm like, no. He said, for some reason, well, he told me what the reason was. They were both in San Antonio, Texas, for completely different things. And somebody at a local radio station found this out and thought it would be a cool idea to get them together in the station for a brief mutual chat. So he got them both there. And I'm listening to this, and it's as clear as if it was recorded yesterday. Absolutely perfect recording. And here's the great H.G. Wells talking to this young kid, wizard kid, Orson Welles. And Orson Welles sounds just like your typical fanboy. And H.G. Wells is trying to make him feel comfortable. He said, I understand that you're making this very interesting movie. And Orson Welles said, oh yeah, we're trying a bunch of different things. You realize he's talking about Citizen Kane, which is in production at the time. And H.G. Wells said, I understand that you made a very interesting radio broadcast of one of my books. And of course, he's talking about the War of the Worlds, and you're listening to this, and it's just like it was recorded yesterday. And then from there, we went, I don't know, he asked what I was doing. I asked what he was doing. He's showing off his computer. And we get into, where I'm going next, including a place called Sigiriya, which I'd never heard of, which has got to be one of the unknown wonders of the ancient world. It's like something out of Indiana Jones. It's this sheer rock, like something out of Monument Valley, and this enormous ruined palace built on top. And the only way up is stairs that have been literally hammered into the side of this sheer cliff, which is decorated with paintings of apsaras, who are beautiful topless God servant. I mean, one wonderful place. And you get up there, and the entrance to this palace is on a lower level, and carved out of the rock was this enormous seated lion. And you would go up through stairs that went through the lion's mouth. And conquerors came through Sri Lanka later and destroyed the whole thing, except for the lion's paws, which are like the size of 18-wheelers. So you can imagine what the whole thing must have looked like. I mean, it's straight out of Indiana Jones, and it's a real place. Never heard of it until Arthur told me about it. Wonderful country, had a wonderful time, wonderful visit. And that was my meeting with Arthur C. Clarke in Sri Lanka. I took a book. I had been given, and then I'll wrap this up. There was an editor at Ballantine Books at the time named Owen Locke, who was editing the science fiction line. And Owen's real interest was in Chinese history and culture, but he was editing the science fiction line. And he would offer me books occasionally from stock there. And he knew I collected. At that point, I was collecting and not just reading. He said, I've got this book here. See if you want it. And it was a copy of Arthur's book, Songs of Distant Earth, but it was bound in blue buckram. And I thought, that's a beautiful book. It had end papers and, bound in page marker. I said, is Del Rey Ballantine doing, limited edition leather bound books now? He said, no. They had a bookbinder come through recently, and he was soliciting business from Random House, and somebody sent him to Owen, and then Owen gave him a couple of books to bind as samples. And this was one of them. He said, would you like to have this? Arthur has the other one. So I said, okay. So years go by, and here I am. I find myself going to Sri Lanka, and I took the book with me. And a couple of others for Arthur to sign, and he signed it and said, there are 2 copies of this book. This is number 2, I have number 1. So that's my best limited edition book story. Edition of 2. And I asked him about the bust of himself in the hotel. He said he hated it. He said it's a terrible likeness. I wish they'd take it out. But he was something of he became something of a national hero for promoting Sri Lanka and for living in the country for, I think, the last 50 years of his life. So that's me and Arthur C. Clarke in Sri Lanka. Afterwards, we went to his club, and he said, do you play ping pong? Or he said, table tennis. And I said a little bit, so we played. Terrific ping pong player, Arthur. I don't know if it had anything to do with his ability to calculate orbital velocities, but he was a great ping pong player.
I hate to do this, but I have to head out. But as always, it's great to talk to you, sir, and thank you for your time. Thanks, guys, for having me today.
Bye, Tom. Thank you for joining us, and I'm just signing off. Thank you, Tom, Flipped Out, Paulie, Adega, Gil. Thank you, Alan, for being here. It was thank you for giving us an update. We're all really concerned about your situation, and it was such a treat to hear everything else that you've been answering. So thank you for your time, Alan.
My pleasure. And
I want to say thank you to Gap Stargate, William Jackson, the Time Prophet, Captain Edward Jellicoe, Celine, Jim Henry, everybody who's been in here, Bird of Prey. We asked them Bird of Prey. I mean, I said it, Bird of Prey. And Jacob, everybody who's been in here. Thank you, Galinda. Thank you, everybody. Be safe. Have an awesome day. And we